So Nathan, we actually heard about you through DGOV community. That's how I was actually introduced to your work. But it came to our attention that you really are very much active in open cooperatives and how we deal with governance issues. So would you provide us with a bit of an intro, how you actually got into that space?
Yeah, sure. So I now teach at the University of Colorado Boulder in media studies. Before that, I was in New York and was actually working as a reporter and was before all this, I did a book on Occupy Wall Street and followed activists out of that protest movement into trying to figure out how to move on with their lives in the context of a world that hadn't, transformed in the ways that they'd liked. And a lot of these people got involved in the cooperative movement, businesses that are owned and governed by the people that they serve, whether they're workers or customers or even small businesses. And this just kind of opened up this tradition for me. On the one hand, I got involved in research about the history of this tradition, and realized that people very different from these kind of scrappy Occupy activists had built this tradition around the world, and actually realized ways in which my family history had been shaped by it here in Colorado. My grandfather, for instance, didn't have electricity on his family farm growing up because the corporate electric companies wouldn't bring electricity until the Rural Electrification Act came around and people were able to build electric cooperatives in rural America. He later then became a director of a national cooperative of hardware stores. And this, so this model, and you couldn't imagine anyone more different from these Occupy activists than my kind of hard farmer grandfather. But it really demonstrated to me that there is a possibility of doing democracy in the economy that we've overlooked, and that in particular this could be of use in the context of the challenges of the online economy. And so I got involved in the early stage of building what became a kind of network or movement known as platform cooperativism, and tied with an idea of open cooperativism. All these are just efforts to try to bring this legacy of economic democracy, into a moment that we think really sorely needs it.
Okay, go for it. You have a question for you?
Oh no, it was just interesting when you said scrappy Occupy activists, and you've done some writing on the Occupy Wall Street movement. Before we jump into your ideas now that you've been developing and helping others to implement in their organizations on community rule, what would you say went wrong with the Occupy Wall Street movement, and what would you say went right? What can we learn from there?
Well, I tried to think of it less in terms of what went wrong and what went right, but what it was doing at that moment. And this was a generation that had just elected, put their energy into and their first political experience into the election of Barack Obama. And, that was an extraordinary moment for many people. But it clearly did not transform everything in the way that, there had been kind of, these people felt in a way that they had been promised. That was at least the experience in the US. This was part of a global movement in 2011 around Arab Spring and so much else. So that's only one piece of it. But in the US, I think the role of Occupy was really for this generation to figure out what is it that we actually stand for. And I think it would be a mistake to say, to criticize the movement for what it wasn't. But I think what it was, was an effort among this generation to figure out, okay, beyond any particular political figure, where do we, what do we really stand for? And that moment, I think, has had, lasting effects on, the horizons of American politics in a number of ways. Certainly in the work that I do on governance now, I think back a lot of times to some of those radically kind of democratic consensus-based meetings and wondering, okay, what if we had had some better tools for how to make decisions there? But in a certain sense, I think that that line of critique can only go so far, and in retrospect, I feel more and more a need to just recognize that that was a particular moment, and many of those people have kind of moved on and are engaged in other sorts of activism using different tactics and techniques that nevertheless advance a lot of the same concerns.
Yeah, like it served its purpose in that moment. It certainly has transformed, the way a lot of people view the world and how they've taken action in their own respective fields. So yeah, I hear you.
You mentioned governance. Now, in blockchain community, a lot of people are actually dealing with governance through the form of decentralized autonomous organizations. There's quite a lot of talks with regard to that. I am quite curious whether you are seeing that DAOs are having a future, or that they present like a viable tool to kind of deal with the governance issues. And also that already leads us to the community rule that you created. I mean, those are the templates that might actually serve as the very foundations for DAOs, perhaps.
Well, it's just connected to what we were saying before. I first heard about Bitcoin during an Occupy meeting, and actually, people like the inventor of the ASIC mining device was involved in this. I mean, there were some interesting overlaps, and I was never really interested because I'm not not one of these people who's just like into money and thinking about money all the time, But when the idea of Ethereum and this DAO possibility first arose in early 2014, I actually first learned about it while I was on my book tour for the Occupy book, visiting San Francisco, and very early in the development of Ethereum, and that idea immediately struck me as relevant, right? That idea of creating tools that would enable people to kind of build their own mini democracies on a protocol. And so that was a kind of thrilling possibility. And ever since then, I've been very kind of involved in that world of those who are trying to build this idea of the decentralized autonomous organization. I think that the challenge of achieving this sort of thing, I think, has been greater than many of the people who got excited about it several years ago, anticipated. And one can point to a number of reasons about, the nature of the technology and so forth. And a lot has to be done in order to build the infrastructure for enabling this stuff. But it's to me, it's a really still a really exciting kind of community, because these are people who are really trying to rethink governance from the ground up. And in contrast, a lot of kind of political activists today are very concerned with trying to reinforce democratic institutions that are several hundred years old, and that were created for a world very different from ours. In contrast, some of the crypto people are really trying to think about what would actually make sense for the world that we're in now. How could we be radically more efficient and creative in our governance designs? And that's a really fun conversation. To me, there's a need for a kind of coming together, for recognition on the side of the blockchain folks that there's a lot of really cool legacies that they can draw on in the many histories of governance, and there's also and that some of those legacies can really learn from what these kind of blockchain hackers are coming up with these days. So figuring out opportunities to identify intersections between those has become a kind of hobby of mine.
I just want to stick a little pin there because I know we love the blockchain communities and they're the ones thinking of these exciting new ways to rethink and reimagine governance. However, there are those of us, and Anja and I met several years ago in 2017, where I brought together people who were interested in this idea of reimagining global governance, and I'm not a blockchain person, to come together and consider how we might form a community. That's why I'm very fascinated by your ideas, a community that was working together to be mutual solidarity and mutually cooperative and across jurisdictions. And I mean, we are still in that community working today, and it's has been a very interesting journey, but it's about us grappling with this exact same thing. How do we lead ourselves if we want to walk away from the top-down centralized governance model that we know is not working for the vast majority of us? But how do we actually achieve things together without some leadership element? And the balance that we struck is we took a model looking at cells and how cells govern themselves, And so we were looking at a leader-full model or service kind of leadership model where if you're performing a particular kind of function, then you're responsible to the community in the context of that function. It's like a service to the community as opposed to a leader in the community. But so I looked at these templates that you've created for all these different types of communities, community rules, different ways in which we can govern ourselves as communities. And I was fascinated. I thought it was incredible. How did you come up with this? Where did you, these templates and all that sort of thing? Because you're not a lawyer. So I want to know, how did you come up with these models and the templates that you have there?
Well, so this project, Community Rule, has come out of something I've been involved in over the last year, which really started out with my own experience as an organizer in online platforms and in online communities. So, for instance, I moderate an email list for the platform co-op community, which has about 500 people on it. And as we started to encounter problems, I realized, wow, the tools we have for governance in online platforms like Facebook groups and email lists and open source communities, these are really terrible tools for even doing the basic stuff. And I kept meanwhile, I was having conversations with my mother, who was in the process of kind of finding her way into this garden club in her community, right? And I was just always blown away. Like, I'm thinking about these online platforms. They're so much, their governance is so much weaker than what my mother's garden club does, just as a matter of course. How could we just catch the Facebook group up with the garden club? And so this has taken a number of forms. I'm now part of a research project called the Meta Governance Project, where we're trying to create a really ambitious, non-blockchain protocol layer for governance for the internet. And all this stuff, and that's going to be many years to come to fruition. But I still felt like, okay, these communities really need to just even have some basic rules on hand. And so Community Rule is an effort to create a kind of quick and dirty way for communities to adopt a kind of basic constitution layer for themselves, so that when difficult challenges arise, they have something to turn to. And they're not just flailing or reverting to a kind of feudalism, which is what I think the default really is in our online community. So as part of this, I've been building, in order to do this, I've been building this tool and have a few of these templates sketched out that are basically designed to be starting points for groups.
So you created them? You created them, Nathan?
I did, and based on just different models that I've encountered in my, in my research and in my personal experience. The goal is not to be innovative. The goal is to take kind of the basic patterns that we tend to see and just make them more explicit. You know, that the target for me is what the 1970s feminist activist Joe Freeman talked about as the tyranny of structurelessness. If nothing else, even if your group is going to be, a top-down hierarchical, feudal mess, let's at least just make it explicit so everybody knows what we're talking about here. That, to me, even that would be a tremendous advance on where we are today.
It's interesting you mentioned explicitly. One thing is actually to just make the foundations available to everyone so that everybody understands what the rules actually are. That's how we communicate the Constitution to everybody, just make it available. Everybody has the access to it. That's definitely one of the rules. I'm actually interested because you do have the word stewardship on the website. So one thing is to make these templates available, and one thing is to make these rules, but the other thing is to communicate those rules and everything with the whole community. So I'm kind of curious, how does the stewardship look like here?
Well, I'm trying to find language that is as generalizable as possible across these different models. And I don't feel satisfied with all of the terms we're using right now. And I think we're going to find ways to develop them. Really, above all, I'm thinking a lot, one model that I have in mind is Creative Commons, which is, where a tool that allows you to select from a fairly small number of licenses and adopt one for the content that you're creating. I want to make it as simple as possible for people to step in and, pick a rule, adopt it, and then ignore it until they need it. And the term stewardship is really just based on identifying who is in charge of making sure that the rules we've agreed on actually get carried out. That's the kind of executive function, essentially, if we think of it in a government sense. And I just think it's that rule, like all these other rules, are just really important to make explicit, so that people know, who is going to be enforcing these rules and who's accountable for enforcing these rules we've agreed on. These basic questions are often missing from our networked communities, to their peril. We rely so much on the mechanism of exit. If you don't like it, you can leave, rather than a mechanism of voice and accountability. And those things shouldn't be so hard. And especially if we want to create communities that have some longevity, I think it's really important to be able to deal with hard questions, to be able to deal with disagreement. And if you don't have some, set of practices in place for how to do that, the smallest disagreement can cause these, what at first seemed like beautiful communities, to just fall apart.
This almost sounds like the theory, or the theory that Grace Rackwani was actually talking about and writing about. She's having a book, Now You Have a DAO, and she's actually quite into the governance of decentralized autonomous organizations, or broadly how organizations are governing themselves. But basically what she was presenting to people was the no fork policy. So we shouldn't really be following, we just, you don't like the group, you don't like the decisions they're making, just fork. And what you're describing sounds a lot like it. We should actually find ways on how we integrate, or how we work with each other, and not just rely on, you can leave at any moment.
Well, as we know from, our experience in markets, that's often a false choice. Right. If for instance, you're part of, like, you're experiencing, or I'm experiencing a disability, right? And there is a really powerful Facebook group of people who also experience that disability, where we're doing really important information sharing. And the person who happens to be the dictator of that group, the moderator, turns out to be a jerk, right? A lot of those people are kind of stuck there because this is their best source of information and solidarity, and forking it might not, be so easy, because it's hard to replicate these networks. And so I think often the reality of that choice of exit is exaggerated. And especially in contexts where people really don't have that choice in a meaningful way, even if technically, yes, you could always just leave group, we need to take seriously the responsibility of voice, of making sure that people can, can correct bad behavior and so forth. So yeah, I think it's often a really false choice.
Mm.
But these are principles, these are principles that are embedded within traditional democracy. Yeah, so participation, accountability, inclusion, and that sort of thing. Why would you say, and I'm not taking the view that this is, I want to know what your view is. Why would you say that we shouldn't just focus a bit on fixing what we have, as opposed to let's reimagine a whole new way of governing ourselves? Because there are quite a few movements right now on participatory governance and opening up central government in a way where there are councils making decisions and citizens have the right, citizens tables and all that sort of thing. Is it an either or there as well? Are you at all advocating that these are not models that can continue to have some sort of validity going forward, but particularly in the political space?
Well, I think, no, I think those kinds of things are essential. And actually, I think it has something to do with the context we're working in. In Europe, those kinds of innovations and explorations are much more common than they are, here in the United States.
And in Latin America and the Caribbean.
That's right. You're absolutely right about that. Thank you. And there's a lot to learn from those that we have a lot to learn from those. What we're experiencing now in the U.S. Is mainly a context where the innovation is happening on a kind of anti-democratic side. And so those who have an interest in democracy are most focused on defending the institutions. And that's important work, but I think they lose sight of the fact that those institutions are in trouble for a reason. And that they need to not just be defending, but kind of, not to overuse the military metaphors, but kind of go on the offensive by adopting this kind of innovation that's necessary, and that societies around the world that are finding ways to be more responsive to their societies are adopting these new kinds of approaches and building them on top of earlier things. I'm absolutely not in favor of kind of sweeping away the old. Actually, this project came out of one of the inspirations for kind of getting me going on this was I was at a conference around some blockchain stuff out of the radical exchange community, and I was struck at the desire that seemed to be there. The desire that seemed to be there for one algorithm, one governance algorithm to solve every governance problem. The desire for the kind of perfect, elegant, programmatic solution. And I started making a list of all the stuff that governance generally requires, all the soft skills, all the relationships, all the debates, the customs, and it was just this vast list. And it just made me realize what we need is more of that complexity to meet the needs of our complex societies, to enter into the mess of, in which people have multiple avenues of interface, rather than assuming that we can find the perfect algorithm, and that we should wipe everything we've learned in our bodies and in our communities away in order to adopt that perfect algorithm. What a mistake that would be.
You're actually the second person that criticizes the radical exchange for the same reason. I think that absolutely there is no one solution fit them all. We will have to actually create something much more agile that constantly changes according to what we're experiencing. So a question, since our audience is basically lawyers, and you are dealing with
Not only lawyers.
We have lawyers and systems. We have quite a lot.
And I thought, well, Anja, I thought the whole purpose of us doing this was to make these issues also accessible to everybody. That's why, Nathan, if you could pop a joke in here, that's going to be great too.
We're not
trying to keep it light. We don't want it to be too. Yeah.
I can open the door and my kids will charge in.
We are very kid friendly as well.
Yeah, we had kids before. No, but okay. So regardless of who our audience is, you are dealing with something that lawyers are kind of familiar or get familiar with while creating companies or helping organizations create and establish their own entities. My question is, how much relevance or what's the connection that you see to the bylaws that we create when we help the companies? Are people even open, especially lawyers? I know that they tend to be much more traditional and, just going with whatever the law suggests. I don't know, maybe in America that's a bit different and you have more flexibility and are a bit more liberal about it. But there are still lawyers are creating the bylaws. Do you see,
Yeah, well, the Community Rule Project is really designed for kind of pre-lawyer contexts, and in a sense also contexts like open source communities, which in the language of Pia Mancini of Open Collective, it's kind of a layer of abstraction over the law. So they try to, often these open source communities, these online communities, yes, they're sitting on top of corporate, sorry.
It's all good. This is live. And this is COVID-19 live.
Yeah. that are, have a legal entity, but, the Facebook group itself does not have a legal form. And so a lot of, this work is targeting those contexts. At the same time, I really, in all of the work I do, have collaborated closely with my lawyer friends. And when I find one of these legal minds who is has the kind of flexibility and creativity, and also the groundedness and in the tradition, it's just gold. And I try to go nowhere without my, without an attorney friend at my side. I think of some of these adventures like. Well, I won't get into it, but it's essential to be able to walk that line. And for instance, here in Colorado, we've been doing some really interesting creative work with cooperative statutes, building really new generation cooperatives on the basis of law that was designed for rural development and farmer cooperatives. And the farmers gifted us this inheritance of really flexible laws that we're now able to use for new generation online platforms. And that's particularly in collaborations with Jason Weiner in his office here. And I think that ability to recognize what the law is capable of enabling, recognizing that the law was created, and that we need to be creative in turn in our response to it is just such a great adventure in this work. And it's an essential part of this work. I mean, I never expected. Now I'm in the process of finishing my second law review article. That was not something I ever expected I would find myself doing, but over and over, it just seems so necessary to work within the language of law in order to create space for democracy.
Yeah, and I when Anja showed me your list of different models that communities could use. I mean, my heart started to sing because I was like, wow, somebody has thought through this and is giving me, the lawyer, what I think is an expanded playbook, right? So when a client comes to me and says, I want to incorporate this company, I can ask questions that would lead me, because right now we would do it on the basis of, okay, well, maybe you want a cooperative, or maybe you want a partnership, or maybe just the legal structures that we're accustomed to. But now what you've done with your research is you're giving lawyers an expanded playbook to say, well, I'm not sure you really need to incorporate if this is not what you want, and this is not an issue for you. This might be something that you may more be interested in. So I'm very, very excited about your work and what you've been producing from that perspective, but also from a perspective Anja and I really wanted to raise with you today. We have been, for the better part of the last year, it must be a year already, Anja, because it was February, March, I think we started the formal work of trying to figure out what a collaborative of lawyers from all over the world who had a shared collective vision. And when I say collective, it's not a national vision, but understanding that there are gaps in our national systems, and understanding that we're all in this one community, one finite planet. And could we create a collective of lawyers that will focus on those intersections, on those gaps, on a collective vision, and progressing the collective visions nationally? And I promise you, it has been very interesting for us to try to figure out how would we work together, and I would love, yes, I'm trying to get advice from you in this call, but how would, and let me make it general, how would any set of would you advise any set of individuals and or corporations or entities who want to find a way to work together, that there may be commercial opportunities that different individuals can and partner amongst each other? So it's not as if it's completely not for profit. So you want to create a situation where people come together, there's a shared collective vision, and they're all be mindful of as they design what their collaboration looks like from a governance perspective. What should they think about? I know you would say there's no hard and fast rule, there's no one perfect governance algorithm, but what should they be thinking about? Just, yeah, because I know there are a lot of people trying to do this now, particularly lots of people working on it before, but there are more people working on it now in the context of COVID-19, and trying to come together and create shared collective resources and all of that. So what's your advice to all of those people out there?
Well, it sounds like a really exciting opportunity, particularly the transnational context. You know, the collaboration I'm working on now is with Morshed Manan, who's at Leiden School of Law and is Bangladeshi, living in the Netherlands. We're working with multiple jurisdictions and trying to develop models for startups converting to democratic ownership, and having that kind of global context is so essential in being able to do creative work and recognizing what different jurisdictions can learn from each other.
Yeah.
So it's just so important. It opens up the mind.
Absolutely.
In terms of governing, I mean, for a network like that, the most neglected, especially for people with a kind of technical mindset, the most neglected piece is always culture. Most governance should be done in culture and norms. And we're seeing that, for instance, in the US right now, in our present kind of process of erosion of democratic institutions. What we're really the main, the rules haven't changed. What keeps changing is the norms are being erased. And it's making us recognize how much just culture and norms are really what makes most governance activity happens. So the work you're already doing in building that culture is so important. And I saw this, for instance, in a similar kind of network called Inspiral, which is based in New Zealand. I went there a few years ago, expecting, I'd known a bunch of people from it. I'd, read all about Inspiral, the great Inspiral, this network of freelancers and companies and so forth, and expected to like arrive and find this amazing like co-working space and all this like infrastructure and all this stuff. And what I was surprised by actually was how like physically thin the network really was. They had a space at one point, but they gave it up, and it was really the thing holding them together was relationship and culture. And they have really interesting rules and really interesting governance models, whatever. But it was really that thick relationship that that made the thing work. And it was a great reminder that there are kind of no shortcuts to good organizing and community building, and that's okay, because actually the long way is the better way, and the long way is where good things happen. And so to me, just doing that common sense work of building trust, building relationship is really where it happens. And which structures you adopt, which of the templates on community rule you might start with, hopefully won't matter that much, because the culture and the norms will be so strong that reverting to the rules will be a fairly occasional experience.
Yeah, but we need to make it explicit, as you've said.
Absolutely.
It's interesting you mentioned that. I mean, it very much reminds me of customary laws. So, for example, instead of having hard laws implemented, or how we call it, the positive laws, we just let the norm emerge and then wait for all the nation states to kind of abide to it and respect it as a rule that should be written. And then over time, we can proclaim that norm to be of a customary nature. And it really is, it really has to do more with the culture itself, and how we respect it and how we deal with that norm within our society, than just having a positive rule written down and everybody abides to it just because it's in the constitution or something like that. Also, what you just said very much reminds me of why, or well, partially the reason why Yugoslavia fell apart. A lot of people, the old ones, the old generations, are even now saying, at the time that Tito was alive, and a lot of people are saying that actually the reason for Yugoslavia to fall apart, and it was like a huge federation, a lot of nation states were strictly abided by the rule, the common constitution that they had, and it fell apart because of one person. One single person actually led the whole Yugoslavia and the whole vision of that area. And it's so interesting to me. It's not only within small organizations. I mean, this expands to the international levels, and brings me back to how we actually met. I mean, what you're talking about, a lot of things, especially from blockchain world, there's no rules. And whatever infrastructure that we create, they all expand and go beyond the borders that we create. So all of a sudden, the notion of having a nation state that is a very artificial form doesn't really make a lot of sense, because all of a sudden countries are no longer having the capacity to control what is happening in a virtual network. And very similarly, that's what's happening with the space, the outer space. I mean, we are having the international rules, sure. The countries are kind of signing them up, but at the same time, for example, what Trump is doing right now, he's very vocal about how the US is not signatory to the Moon Agreement, and therefore, the customary rule is never going to be established. So yeah, to some extent, it's very interesting. And for a lawyer like ourselves, it's been an incredible journey to just kind of see how law and how norms develop in our society today. And it's been also very interesting to observe how, the innovation that we are presenting in these days, we can no longer keep track of it. not the innovation itself, but how do we form good guidelines around that innovation? How do we communicate to the society? You know, that's a red flag. That should be prohibited. You shouldn't do that. And then we rely on the nation state, but it's not enough. And the COVID-19, I think, actually presented that in a very new form. So what has happened in the couple of days or a couple of weeks, let's say, is that countries are now presenting a lot of surveillance measures. And it's becoming a norm. So to me, that's like, okay, is that going to be a new normal? And if yes, how do we keep track of it? How do we, I mean, can we even prevent that from becoming a new norm? And if there is like a law without a sunset clause, what it is that we can do together? So this is partially why we actually are bringing lawyers together and do want to keep track of all the measures and creating this database, right? I mean, it's a lot of work just to think about how a database of all these legal measures and the policies that are emerging right now might actually look like. But a couple of days ago, I was actually looking at your website, the platform co-op directory. And I've seen that it's not impossible. Obviously, you've made such a directory. I mean, it's not that you are creating the directory of all the legal measures, but you are creating a directory of the co-ops. And along with that, I do believe that that's almost like a directory of all the bylaws that these cooperatives are actually abided to, right? Or at least some of the norms, some of the governance rules that they are creating. So a question, how did you find yourself creating that directory, and what value does it have for the whole cooperative movement, and how do you even manage that kind of a directory? Like, those are all the questions that I'm kind of dealing with right now.
So yeah, so the directory at the Internet of Ownership website is, it really just came out of, you know, maybe you've had this experience. I was organizing the first conference for platform cooperativism. As a result, I found myself at the nexus of a network where I was having more visibility into the network than most people in it. And that felt wasteful. And so as I was beginning to see the network in the process of organizing the conference, it just felt like I should make sure that we have a public resource so that this information is accessible to people. And you know, since then, now people submit their own profiles and all this stuff, and it kind of manages itself in some respects. And we're trying to get more bylaws in the library portion of that directory, though we don't have as many as we would like, because it would be nice to have more of that available. But you know, what you were saying about international governance too is part of the motivation for me in this. You know, our online platforms are potentially kind of new polities, and you know, Mark Zuckerberg certainly sees this in terrifying ways. You know, he has, you know, written things that make him sound like he really sees himself as the kind of emperor of the new political system of the world. And in a way that's, you know, that's terrifying, but in a way that's kind of, if that system of Facebook were something where we had, you know, real rights, and where there were a truly global governance process, you know, that could help offset some of the nationalist retrenchment that we're seeing. And that's part of the dream. Like, one of our more successful platform co-ops, Stocks United, is a stock photo platform with photographers in dozens of countries, right? All self-governing this company together. And you know, what an experience you get when you're part of a multinational global democracy through a context like that. You know, for me, these kind of international networks of, you know, entrepreneurs and activists have been so essential in opening my mind beyond, you know, my particular context. And you know, one of the hopes of creating frameworks for more democratic platforms is that we might get used to the practice, build the muscle memory for, you know, just doing good global collaborative governance as a matter of course. And that's, you know, it's all about that muscle memory. That to me is also part of the motivation for community rule is like, okay, if you're going to be in a Facebook group, just, let's use that excuse to practice some good governance. Everywhere you go, just practice it a little bit. Just get it into your mind. Just ask that question, what are the underlying rules here? If I want to get more deeply involved, if there's a dispute, let's make sure we have a good, sensible, well-tested system in place.
What about at the family level? Do you have your your governance system? Do you have your I see my internet is lagging, but do you have a good governance system in your family?
Well, I hope so. On a good
Should
day.
we be doing that?
On a good day.
Should we be using our families to practice this and negotiating this space, this relational space?
Sometimes the politics of our family lives is hard to see because you're so close to it. Maybe in a few decades I'll be able to reflect better on it. We're doing the best we can, and also in the context of of such close relationships, because we're, especially now in COVID world, we're interacting with each other constantly every day. The need for these kind of formal rules is very low. We can manage mainly through norms and communication. When rules matter most and structures matter most when when those things aren't as available.
Yeah. Does it sound like there's like at the global online level, at least, just listening to would you say that there are some customary practices that are developing? There's some norms, there are global norms developing that we in the online space seem to be operating under.
Absolutely. One example that I've been working on lately is the open source communities, right? And for years I've been, I love using open source software. I'm, doing this interview on a Linux computer and all this stuff. But at the same time, I'm kind of plagued by the way in which, for instance, 95% of open source contributors are male. The way in which privilege just runs deeply through this movement. And when you look at testimonies, for instance, from women in open source, what you often hear is, toxic culture. You hear that this is and that there are so many structures of power that they experience that aren't explicit. It goes back to that feminist critique of the kind of hidden structures that emerge when a structure isn't made explicit. This is just an example of a community and a culture where the unwritten stuff, is kind of deeply problematic, and at the same time, the unwritten stuff is what's empowering and enabling the community to function. So it's a real dilemma, and the open source world is really struggling with that right now, which is, do we risk jettisoning our culture that underlies how we work and has created a lot of really productive activity to create a more inclusive kind of culture, or do we kind of cling to what we have and let those other people do whatever they want or not. But it's such an example of how the limitations, of how powerful norms are in driving our online collaborations, and how important it is to be willing to work with them, to let them bend, to let them evolve.
It's interesting how you say, I think that there's a lot of issues with open source communities, and it would actually deserve like another call just to address all of them. Perhaps the ratio is one of them. We also heard about how the funding might actually be problematic as well. And yeah, that actually deserves a lot of attention. And I would be willing to actually jump on another call just to address all these notions, how we could help the open communities, because the database that we are creating, we do aim to make it open source completely. We are recognizing how important the open access is, and yeah, there's going to be a lot of issues. It's going to be a challenge, but I do hear you, and I've been aware of the male supremacy, not only in the open source, the blockchain space as well, and it's incredible. It does bring a completely different power dynamic. I'm aware of the time, yeah.
No, and it's so ironic because these communities, at least structurally, you look at them from the outside and you say, well, these are open, anybody can join, they're inclusive, they claim to be inclusive, and yet some of the communities in our worlds that claim the most inclusivity and seem the most structurally open are like weirdly more unwelcoming than, you know, a company that you have to go through a ridiculous hiring process to get into. And it's a striking paradox, and one that we need to take really seriously.
I absolutely agree. I think that there's a lot of aspects that, or at least we need to look at these structures from different lenses. I very much enjoyed the conversation that we are having.
It's really good to hear what you all are building. I'm glad some of the things I've been doing are of use, and it really means a lot. Thank you.
Yeah, not only is it going to be of use, I think it's going to be very beneficial and very helpful. People need to understand why we are building the open source communities and why this infrastructure is so important. So yeah, thank you so much for all the blogging and all the work that you put in.
Thank you. Thank you. Be well.
Yeah, you
Be
too.
healthy.
Thanks.